Across the fence, we're digging in on where water goes once it hits the ground. University of Vermont Extension is beginning a groundbreaking study to find out what's going on underneath the farm field. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Hydrology is the study of how water moves on the earth. In Vermont, we've generally focused on what happens on the surface, but what about the water below ground? Until recently, researchers haven't had a good way to calculate how nutrients like phosphorus move downward through the soil. This information is crucial to get a better picture of what challenges Vermonters face when it comes to water quality. Across the Fence's Keith Silva has our story on how UVM researchers hit on this new information.
Sometimes science requires precision and finesse, and other times it helps to have a sledgehammer. Joshua Faulkner is University of Vermont Extension's Farming and Climate Change Coordinator. Faulkner is trying to hammer home the answer to the question of what happens to rainwater once it soaks into the soil.
We take this can, we pound it down and fill it up with soil without disturbing that soil, so it's kind of taken straight out of the soil profile. We then put that can onto a water collector and lower it down into the 6-foot deep hole we've augured out back here. And then we cover it back up with soil and the natural vegetation that's already here in the field. When we have a rainfall event, as they spread manure, water and whatever it's carrying with it, phosphorus perhaps, leaches down through the soil into our can, into our collector that's attached to that can, and then we can pump it out and actually take that water back to the laboratory and analyze it for what's in that water.
The device is called a lysimeter.
And that's a core.
This pasture at Shelburne Farms was chosen specifically for its heavy clay soil, which is characteristic of much of the farmland adjacent to Lake Champlain.
This equipment's designed to measure what nutrients and water are actually leaching down through the soil. We're installing it at a location at Shelburne Farms where there's currently some equipment that's measuring what runs off the top of the soil, which is fantastic, but it doesn't really tell us what actually moves down through the soil. So we're trying to capture that as well, so we get a kind of a total picture of how phosphorus and water are moving through our farm landscape here at Shelburne Farms.
Phosphorus is one of the nutrients found in manure. When farmers apply too much manure, the phosphorus can run off into waterways like Lake Champlain. This runoff causes algae blooms and excessive aquatic plant growth that can harm wildlife and limit recreation and enjoyment of the lake. It's possible to estimate how much phosphorus is running off the surface, but not what's happening below ground. That's why the data in the lysimeter is so crucial. For the first time, researchers will have a better picture of how much phosphorus is coming from Vermont farms.
As far as we can tell, there's very little data available for leaching of phosphorus in Vermont. I'm sure we have some data from other states, but we're unique, right? We have Vermont soils and Vermont management practices on farms, so we really want to know what's happening here in our state. Because the stakes are so much higher now, because, to use the R word, regulation may be involved, we want to make sure we nail this and know exactly how much phosphorus is running off or leaching down through the soil profile, because this has real life implications for farmers and water quality, of course, and people that use the lake.
As for a hypothesis, Faulkner and his fellow researchers are cautious.
We don't know, but I would expect that in some of these heavier clays, we're not going to see a lot of phosphorus moving downward, that a lot of the phosphorus we see leaving the fields is probably coming off the surface in these really tight, heavy soils.
That's the big question, is what will we find in those below ground samples, because we just don't have a very good idea.
Carol Adair is a biogeochemist in UVM's Rubenstein School for Environment and Natural Resources, and she's the co-researcher on this project with Faulkner. Answering the phosphorus question allows Adair and Faulkner to begin to offer solutions.
The other thing that we're really interested in is, are there management techniques that farmers are using that really impact that? So, is putting your manure on in a different way, maybe by injecting it, does that have a different effect than if you just spread it on your field? What are some things we could do to keep those nutrients on your field instead of leaving in some other way? I mean, preferably you want to keep that stuff where your plants can get it. You don't want it going off the field. So, we want to figure that. That's the thing that we're really interested in figuring out is, are there things that people can do to keep keep those nutrients on their field for their plants?
This research project is taking place at Shelburne Farms and at another farm in Williston. This second site is on sandier soils, river bottom land that's key to growing crops in the Champlain Valley. Conducting this research on farms gives Faulkner and Adair the best laboratory they could ask for.
In extension, we want to do our practical applied research on operating farms so that we get as accurate as possible picture of how farmers are actually managing in real life. We don't want to control that for what we think might be best from a research perspective necessarily. We want to know what's actually happening on the ground on Vermont farms. We really can do that on these farms, and they're gracious enough to open up their farms and let us come on and kind of muck around in their fields and kind of do the science that we think is important and we want to do.
Research takes brains and occasionally brawn. The data this project will provide puts another piece in place to help improve the overall picture of water quality in Vermont. In Shelburne, I'm Keith Silva with Across the Fence.
Well, thank you, Keith. Joining me now are UVM Extension's Farming and Climate Change Coordinator, Joshua Faulkner, and a member of Joshua's research team, UVM graduate student Lindsay Barbieri. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Joshua, tell us a little bit more about your project in general and what you're hoping to learn.
Sure. So this is a project funded by the USDA, and really our primary goal is to compare conventional farming systems to alternative farming systems. And to do that, we're measuring a few things on farms, primarily some of the ecosystem services that farms provide to society. For one, we're looking at food production, how much food the farm is producing for the folks who need the food. We're looking at water quality impacts, and we're looking at climate change mitigation questions on those farms. There are a lot of questions there, and so there's a much larger research team than just myself and Lindsay and Carol. We have, for example, David Connor, also from UVM, who's looking into how much these practices cost the farmer to actually implement them on the farm. We also have another water scientist, Stephanie Hurley, and myself, who are looking at some of the phosphorus leaching and the phosphorus runoff questions. And then we have an agroecologist, Ernesto Mendez, also from UVM, and Rachel Chapman, who are looking at the question of why or why not a farm would choose to implement these practices and what some of the barriers may be.
Excellent. Well, so what exactly are the farming practices you're looking at?
So like I said, we're comparing some conventional practices to alternative practices, and for this study, we've really confined ourselves to dairy farms. It's a big part of Vermont agriculture. At the Shelburne site, the first one that Keith showed, we're only working in hay ground, which is definitely a prime land use on dairy farms. And we're comparing how farmers would typically surface apply manure, spread manure on the ground, versus spreading manure, but before they spread the manure, actually aerating the soil. So trying to break up the soil just a little bit, get some oxygen down in there, help the soil microbes to cycle that manure once it soaks into the soil, and also break up the soil a little bit so that the manure does move downward into the soil and not sit on the surface. At the Williston farm, we're working in cornfields, and there we're really comparing a conventional tillage where we're turning the soil and surface applying manure, just spreading it on the surface of the ground, versus a no-till where we're not disturbing the soil when we plant our corn, and also an injection of the manure. So again, not keeping it on the surface, but putting it down into the root zone of the crops where they can more quickly access that manure.
Well, climate change, greenhouse gases, Lindsay, talk a little bit about what those two things have to do with farming, because people might be surprised.
Yeah, definitely. Well, from a global perspective, agriculture is one really major way that I think humans interact with our environment, and a lot of agricultural practices actually contribute to emissions of greenhouse gases, and these are gases that are emitted from agricultural practice, such as carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane are sort of the three major ones. And these gases can be emitted from various farm management practices and even from the soil themselves.
Really?
Yeah. And in the US, for example, about 9% of our total greenhouse gas emissions actually come from farming. So it's actually a major sector where greenhouse gas emissions are important. So it's a crucial thing, I think, to look at when we're talking about environmental impacts of farming.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you measure greenhouse gases in the farm field?
It's a great question. Right now what we're doing is we have these small chambers of PVC pipe, and we put them on the soil. And what we do is we close them off, and we have an instrument called a photoacoustic gas analyzer that we're able to take into the field. And once we close the chamber off, we measure the gas buildup in that chamber. So for a certain spot on the field, covering over the soil. So we're measuring the gas buildup in that chamber over time, and we can get a rate, an emissions rate, for that one part of the soil. And then we do that for a couple of different spots on the field and can kind of scale that up to get a sense of what the entire field might look like in terms of soil emissions.
So are there things that we know about right now that farmers can do to help with water quality and climate change, which are, connected, obviously?
Yeah, and that's one of the really great things, Judy, is that a lot of the things Extension has been promoting and others in the state have been promoting for water quality improvements are the exact same practices that are good for climate change mitigation. Things like how we manage our nutrients on our farms, getting nutrient management plans and applying nutrients at the right time, the right place and the right amount. Also, just improving soil quality. So lots of the practices that I think we hear about nowadays, like cover crops and no-till. These are things that really help with building healthy soils that infiltrate water and help prevent runoff, but also help keep carbon stored in the soil and reduce some of the gas emissions that Bar had talked about just a minute ago.
Mm-hmm. I think, too, it's interesting to point out that, farmers want to keep those nutrients in the soil. They want a healthy soil because it's better for their crops, for their animals, and their bottom line.
That's right, and that's we're really excited about these results because this is what farmers want to know. They want to see proof that what they're doing on their farms is truly working towards help cleaning up the lake. And studies like these, providing that information for those farmers through Extension and the university, are really a great way to build confidence in these practices.
Mm-hmm. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how this information might be used in Vermont?
Sure. So this will greatly inform our programs in Extension as we take information out to farmers and tell them about what works and what doesn't, and how well it works. I also believe this will help with some of the programs that some of our agencies use in the state and how they design technical assistance and cost share assistance to farmers, and maybe ultimately influence some of the policy that's developed in Vermont.
Does research take into account economic factors?
Sure does, yeah. And we have David Connor on our team from UVM who's looking at the cost of these practices, of what it actually costs the farmer out of pocket to implement these, as well as looking at the yield. So what's the return that he or she would get from implementing these practices and comparing those conventional alternative situations.
And I would imagine, like almost anything else, it wouldn't be immediate. It might be over a series of years.
That's the expectation, yeah.
Yeah, and our project is actually going to be going forward from now for the next 4 years. So this is definitely a long-term study for sure.
Joshua and his team have put together a website that highlights the resources and also contacts related to water quality and agriculture in the state. The website's there on your screen. It's uvm.edu/SUSAGCTR, Sustainable Ag Center. On the webpage, click on Resources and you'll find the link to water quality research. The website again is uvm.edu/SUSAGCTR, and then click on the link to resources. So what's the next move? We're heading into the springtime. What's the next move on the field for you?
I think we're going to get back out on those farms, start to fine-tune some of the research equipment that we just installed. Yeah. We were actually out there yesterday at Shelburne Farms going through our sampling protocol. We're also going to do some soil sampling to go along with the water sampling that we've started.
And so research that you get is going to be ongoing?
Absolutely, the next 4 years, and if we're able to secure more funding, we'd like to push it even longer. The longer we can do it, the more confidence we'll have in our results.
Well, terrific. I want to thank you for coming on today and sharing your research. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.